You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Founded in 1881, the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War is a congressionally chartered, charitable, fraternal organization that preserves the history and legacy of the Union veterans who fought during the Civil War to save the Union and end slavery.
When you join, you enter a national network of men who form lifelong bonds, honor their heroic ancestors, and promote historic preservation, education, and patriotism in their communities.
The Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War accepts both descendants of Civil War veterans and non-descendants. Visit them today at www.suvcw.org or email them at join@suvcw.org.
The views, information, or opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the SUVCW.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 458 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast. As y'all will recall, with the last two shows, we've given some background to William Tecumseh Sherman's Meridian raid, and we've also discussed the evolution in Sherman's thinking regarding how to prosecute the war.
And now, with this show, we'll look at the raid itself. Meridian was about 130 miles due east from Vicksburg. The town, population 400, would seem an insignificant speck on the map, except that it was a major rail hub. These were crucial railroads that the Confederates used to move troops and transport vast amounts of supplies. So it's no wonder Sherman saw Meridian as a prize well worth taking.
If he could lay waste to the place, like his men had done to Jackson in July 1863, he believed it would not only hinder future rebel operations in Mississippi, but would also be a blow to the larger Confederate war effort.
Sherman intended to make the march right across the state of Mississippi and then back with 20,000 infantry and a brigade of cavalry. Major General Stephen Hurlbut would lead 10,000 men from his 16th Corps southward from Memphis to Vicksburg, where he would join a like number of men from Major General James McPherson's 17th Corps. Colonel Edward Winslow's cavalry brigade would serve as the expedition's eyes and ears, as Hurlbut's and McPherson's columns, following separate but parallel routes, marched east from Vicksburg across the Magnolia State to Meridian.
To distract the attention of the formidable Confederate cavalry general Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was then operating in northern Mississippi, a division of 7,000 Federal horsemen's force left Vicksburg. Smith would move south, following the line of the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, destroying the line as he went, and meet up with Sherman at Meridian.
Standard military doctrine said that an army operating in enemy territory had to maintain a well-established line of communication and supply to the rear. But previously, during Ulysses S. Grant's operations in the Magnolia State, when he'd been trying to get at Vicksburg, he was surprised to discover that the bountiful Mississippi countryside held such an abundance of foodstuffs, which might be confiscated, that if push came to shove, it would be possible for his forces to subsist, at least for a short while, by living almost completely off the land. Now, on Sherman's march to Meridian and back, he was going to put that premise to the test.
Sherman's march on Meridian was essentially going to be a large-scale raid. The Federals would march there, lay waste to the place, then march back to friendly lines. Since the expedition wasn't meant to hold ground, but was going to be only a temporary foray into the hostile countryside of Mississippi, Sherman intended that his men would largely live off the land as they went, rather than worrying about maintaining a lengthy supply line back to Vicksburg. Sherman wrote, quote, "We will take all provisions, and God help the starving families."
Sherman's march across Mississippi to Meridian in February 1864 would see him put into practice what he'd learned during the first 3 years of the Civil War about how to best bring the Confederacy to its knees and end the war sooner rather than later.
Sherman's men would wage a campaign of destruction. They'd seize physical property, including foodstuffs and forage, that they needed to sustain their expedition, while also destroying property and supplies that might be used to support any future Confederate military operations in Mississippi.
But Sherman intended there would also be a psychological component to these activities, since part of his strategy was to quash any hope the people of Mississippi had for a Confederate victory in the war. He meant to inflict such harm upon Southern civilians that it would break their morale, to the point they would stop supporting the Confederate war effort.
With his raid on Meridian, William Tecumseh Sherman would complete the transformation from the officer he'd been earlier in the war, who punished his men for stealing fence rails for their campfires, to the commander who now believed, quote, "We cannot change the hearts of the people of the South, but we can make war so terrible that they will realize their folly, however brave and gallant and devoted to their country they may be."
In February 1864, Sherman intended to make Mississippi howl, and he would make no apologies for it. He had come to believe, as he put it, that, quote, "War is cruelty. There is no use trying to reform it. The crueler it is, the sooner it will be over."
On the morning of February 3rd, the Federal advance to Meridian started off as two blue columns. Hurlbut on the left and McPherson on the right departed Vicksburg, heading for the Big Black River. Sherman was setting off with about 23,500 infantry and cavalry.
Sherman had learned that the Confederate commander who would oppose his movement was Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk, the Confederate Bishop General, who recently, in fact, only on January 28th, had taken command of the Department of Mississippi, Alabama, and East Louisiana. When Sherman set off from Vicksburg, Polk was in Meridian, while his two infantry divisions, led by Major Generals William Wing Loring and Samuel French, were respectively in Canton, about 24 miles north of Jackson, and Brandon, a dozen miles east of the state capital.
Polk's cavalry was commanded by Major Generals Stephen D. Lee and Nathan Bedford Forrest. Lee's horsemen were picketing the region between Yazoo City and Jackson, while Forrest was in the hill country of northern Mississippi, about 50 miles south of Memphis.
Altogether, Polk had almost 22,000 infantry and cavalry under his command, a force almost equal in number to the Federals setting off from Vicksburg. But as the Yankees started their march, Polk's command was far too scattered to present a coordinated threat to Sherman's advance.
On February 4th, the second day of Sherman's movement, the Union cavalry screening McPherson's advance were passing near the old Champion Hill battlefield when they were surprised by rebel horsemen commanded by Brigadier General Wirt Adams.
The surprised Yankee cavalrymen were roughly handled by the Confederates. But even though Wirt Adams rushed up the few reinforcements he had available, the rebels couldn't match the weight of enemy numbers once McPherson's Federal infantry arrived on the scene, and Adams ordered his men to withdraw.
To the south, Hurlbut's column spent the day contending with more Confederate cavalry, led by Colonel Peter Stark. When the Federals finally pried the rebel horsemen out of their blocking position, Stark pulled back to the east.
Between them, Adams and Stark only had around 1,300 rebel horsemen, far too few to seriously contest the enemy advance, and by noon on the 5th, the Yankee cavalry entered Clinton, less than a dozen miles from Jackson. As Sherman approached the state capital, an alarmed Polk, who was now down at Mobile, Alabama, issued orders for Loring and French to concentrate and dig in at Morton, a town on the railroad about 30 miles east of the state capital. Polk also instructed Stephen D. Lee and Nathan Bedford Forrest to use their horsemen to mount immediate raids on the Yankees' supply lines, which he mistakenly assumed Sherman would be dependent upon. Polk didn't know, of course, that Sherman was going to live off the land, and so wasn't going to concern himself with maintaining a supply line back to Vicksburg.
Before Leonidas Polk departed Mobile and returned to Meridian, he fired off frantic telegrams pleading for reinforcements to Joseph E. Johnston at Dalton, Georgia, and P.G.T. Beauregard at Charleston, South Carolina. Beauregard sent back word that he had no troops to spare, while Joe Johnston never even bothered to reply.
Meanwhile, as the Federals passed through Jackson, they once again visited destruction upon the Mississippi state capital. One Yankee soldier wrote, quote, "During the 5th and 6th, it seemed as though everything that had previously escaped the torch managed to take fire, especially on the business streets. The destruction was particularly sad, and years will not erase the effects of war in Jackson."
After once again wreaking havoc upon Jackson, the Federals crossed the Pearl River on a just-completed pontoon bridge and continued their march eastward. As they left the ravaged state capital behind on February 7th, the mild weather turned nasty as strong winds and icy cold temperatures lashed the Mississippi countryside. Nevertheless, the Yankees pressed on and reached the small town of Brandon, about a dozen miles east of Jackson, on the afternoon of the 7th.
Sherman was pleased with how well the expedition was proceeding. He was particularly happy at how readily the rebels had fallen back and abandoned Jackson. The only fly in the ointment was when he learned that William Soy Smith, who, as you guys will recall, was supposed to keep Nathan Bedford Forrest occupied, well, Smith was only now leaving Memphis with his cavalry division, way behind schedule. Sherman reported, quote, "The delay of Smith at Memphis may compel me to modify my plans a little, but not much."
This episode of the podcast is sponsored by the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War.
Do you have an interest in the Civil War? Founded in 1881, the SUV-CW is a congressionally chartered, charitable, fraternal organization that preserves the history and legacy of the Union veterans who fought during the Civil War to save the Union and end slavery.
The national headquarters of the SUV-CW is located at the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. When you join, you enter a national network of men who form lifelong bonds, honor their heroic ancestors, and promote historic preservation, education, and patriotism in their communities.
The SUV-CW is the heir to the legacy of the Grand Army of the Republic, the famous post-war National Association of Union Civil War Veterans. Based on the principles of fraternity, charity, and loyalty, the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War accepts both descendants of Civil War veterans and non-descendants. Visit them today at www.suvcw.org or email them at join@suvcw.org.
The views, information, or opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the SUV-CW.
History isn't black and white, yet too often it's presented as such. Grey history of the French Revolution is a long-form history podcast dedicated to exploring the ambiguities and nuances of the past. By contrasting both the experiences of contemporaries and the conclusions of historians, Grey History dives into the detail and unpacks one of the most important and disputed events in human history, from a revolution based on hope and liberty to its descent into the infamous Reign of Terror. There's plenty to discuss and plenty of grey to explore. One can't understand the modern world without understanding the French Revolution. So if you're looking for your next long-form, binge-worthy history podcast, one recommended by universities and loved by enthusiasts, then check out Grey History: The French Revolution today, or simply search for the French Revolution.
When Leonidas Polk had received news that the Federals were advancing from Vicksburg in force, he had immediately assumed that Sherman's target was the port of Mobile, down on the Gulf Coast. He stubbornly refused to believe otherwise, even after receiving word from his scouts that the Yankees, quote, do not try to conceal that their destination is Meridian.
Polk may have been a successful Episcopal clergyman, but his abilities as a military commander were, limited. And he was certainly not the general you wanted to be holding an independent command at a moment of crisis, especially when he was facing an aggressive opponent. Here, after returning to Meridian, Polk remained there and left Wing Loring in command in the field. There at Morton, Loring and French had positioned their men on high ground outside the town. Hastily thrown up field works added to the natural strength of the Confederate position.
The Federals set out from Brandon on the morning of the 8th. As they had done every step of the way so far, the Yankees left destruction in their wake, demolishing the railroad, seizing and destroying supplies, and making liberal use of the torch to burn just about everything else. A Federal soldier wrote in his diary, "We went into camp about 2 miles east of the once pretty village of Brandon. This place, like Jackson, was none the better for our occupation, with foraging and fire doing fearful work."
That evening, the Federals halted just 4 miles short of Morton. The next day, February 9th, they advanced, but contented themselves with probing the rebel defenses. However, by that afternoon, on the Confederate side, Loring was convinced he couldn't mount a successful defense of Morton against the force Sherman was bringing to bear against the place, so he ordered a withdrawal.
The next day, the 10th, the Federals swarmed into Morton, laying waste to the place. The few rebel cavalrymen who had been left behind retreated to the northeast toward Hillsborough. When pursuing Yankees were fired on from several houses there, they retaliated by setting fire to nearly every building in the village.
Polk frantically wired Richmond, informing the Confederate War Department that Morton had fallen, and then misinforming the authorities that the Yankees had, quote, turned toward Mobile today, end quote. Still clinging to his belief that that blockade-running port was Sherman's target, Polk moved a good part of his infantry south to block Sherman's path to the Gulf Coast, and he sent all possible reinforcements to Mobile.
The Federals continued their advance toward Meridian on the 11th. They covered only 13 miles that day, as swampy ground, rather than enemy opposition, slowed their progress. The roads here along this stretch of the march were simply ribbons of seemingly bottomless mud running through impenetrable brush. Men and horses and mules exhausted themselves struggling to free countless bogged-down wagons and artillery pieces.
February 12th dawned cold and clear as the Federals trudged out of the swamps and into the rolling, sparsely populated pine country to the east. That day, Sherman penned a note to Hurlbut asking, "Do you hear anything from W. Soy Smith?" You see, Sherman was worried, because other than the news that he and his cavalry had belatedly left Memphis, since then no one had heard a thing from Smith.
Meanwhile, Leonidas Polk had finally realized that Sherman's target was Meridian rather than Mobile. However, his complete misreading of the situation up until that point meant that Polk now had little on hand to stop the Yankees from reaching the vital rail hub, which was in immediate danger.
Now, having left himself few options and with no good defensive ground upon which to make a stand, Polk decided it was better to live again to fight another day, so he would exit Mississippi and give up Meridian to the Federals. He issued orders to Stephen Lee to pull back to Meridian with his cavalry and cover the retreat of the Confederate infantry, which marched east across the state line toward Demopolis, Alabama.
Lee's rebel cavalry did what it could to slow down Sherman while the Confederate infantry got away, and while as many supplies and as much equipment as possible was hastily removed. But Lee's efforts merely delayed the inevitable, and about 5 p.m. on Saturday, February 14th, the Yankees entered Meridian.
The town's destruction began the next day. The locomotive repair shops, the arsenal that produced small arms, and dozens of warehouses containing supplies and material of all descriptions were all destroyed. Sherman would report, quote, "For 5 days, 10,000 men worked hard and with a will in that work of destruction."
Meanwhile, other Federals went to work on the rail lines that fed into Meridian, destroying 115 miles of track and burning 61 bridges. Foraging columns fanned out into the surrounding countryside, stripping farms of livestock and foodstuffs.
Throughout the week that Sherman spent bringing hell to Meridian, Lee's rebel cavalry harassed the Federal columns that roamed the surrounding area, but the Confederate horsemen could do little harm to the enemy as the Yankees moved about at will, destroying the railroads and pillaging farms and plantations.
On the 18th, with Soy Smith's cavalry division still missing in action, Sherman decided he would pull out of Meridian in 2 days' time and head back to Vicksburg. By the way, with the next episode, we'll do a bit of a postscript to Sherman's Meridian raid by looking at what did happen to Smith and his Federal cavalry after they left Memphis. Spoiler alert, Nathan Bedford Forrest plays a major role in that story.
Well, at any rate, Sherman withdrew from Meridian on February 20th. As they moved a bit north of their previous line of march, Hurlbut's and McPherson's columns cut another path of destruction across the middle of Mississippi. Lee's rebel cavalry dogged the flanks of the Yankee columns, but the Federals faced no real opposition on their march west.
On the 26th, the Federal infantry recrossed the Pearl River and entered Canton, some 25 miles north of Jackson. They destroyed the town of 2,500 people and the rail lines surrounding it.
The next day, Sherman went on ahead to Vicksburg to discuss a planned joint operation on the Red River with Major General Nathaniel Banks. It wasn't until March 1st that Hurlbut and McPherson marched away from Canton, or what was left of it. 2 days later, on the 3rd, after being gone a month, the Federals reached their old encampments outside Vicksburg.
Meanwhile, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who was appalled that Sherman could march virtually unopposed across Mississippi, had ordered Joe Johnston to send William Hardee and 10,000 men as reinforcements to aid Polk. For his part, Polk was glad for the men and made all the appropriate noises about being eager to destroy Sherman, but the reinforcements didn't arrive at Demopolis until February 27th, long after the Federals were out of harm's way.
Sherman listed his casualties for the entire expedition as 21 killed, 68 wounded, and 81 missing. He reported capturing some 400 prisoners. An estimated 5,000 escaped slaves accompanied the Federals back to Vicksburg. Sherman would boast that his men returned from their march across Mississippi quote, in better health and condition than when we started.
In one way, Sherman's raid was a failure, since as soon as he evacuated Meridian, the Confederates moved back in, immediately setting to work repairing the damage that had been done to the rail lines, and once again beginning to use the place as a major supply depot. Within weeks, most of the damage had been repaired, and the lost supplies and equipment had been replaced.
Of course, it's harder to measure the success of Sherman's orders to visit devastation upon the Mississippi countryside as part of his strategy to deny resources to the Confederate war effort and break the morale of the civilian population. All that can be said with certainty is that the methodical and widespread federal foraging and pillaging and the burning of farms, villages, and towns would have created real hardships and caused untold suffering for the locals.
In a letter home after the expedition's return to Vicksburg, one federal soldier claimed, quote, "We left every town that we passed through in ashes."
There was one way that Sherman's Meridian raid was an unqualified success for him, in that it confirmed for him that an army really could live off the southern countryside while seizing and or destroying the enemy's resources. And in that sense, as an example of hard war, Meridian really was a dress rehearsal for the campaign Sherman would later wage on his march to the sea across Georgia. In October 1864, before he set out to cut a destructive path through the Peachtree State, Sherman would tell Ulysses S. Grant, "I can make the march and make Georgia howl." Well, Sherman was confident of his ability to do just that, because in February 1864, he had successfully pulled off much the same thing in Mississippi, when he made this march right across the Magnolia State, targeting Meridian.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is How the North Won the War by Herman Hattaway and Archer Jones.
You can find a complete list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org. Also at the website, you can find information on becoming a member of the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Jimmy S., Dagomar, and C. March did this past week.
A big thank you to each of them, and also thanks to Yuli H. for his donation.
And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode. Tracy and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.